the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear.
Camilla's story could not be more different. For decades, she lived in the storm's eye, cast as the villain in a love triangle that nearly destroyed the monarchy's image. She was the woman the tabloids scorned, the figure Diana's admirers could never forgive. Though years have softened some of that hostility, though Charles placed a crown upon her head, the whispers never truly vanished. Where Catherine's name brings admiration, Camilla's still carries the weight of history's suspicion. And at the heart of it all is Charles himself, caught between two women who served different purposes in his reign. Camilla, the loyal companion, the comfort in private halls, the partner who stood by him long before the world accepted their bond. And Catherine, the radiant emblem, the modern jewel of the monarchy, the woman whose popularity cushions the institution's survival. One offers him personal solace, the other public legitimacy. He has relied on them both in different ways, knowing that without Catherine's image, the monarchy's fragile hold on affection might falter, and without Camilla's presence, his private life would feel incomplete. This delicate balance could never last. Catherine's spotless devotion made her not just beloved, but untouchable. Camilla's lingering controversies made her, at times, a liability the crown had to defend. The lines of loyalty, affection, and power were bound to blur. And so, on the day Charles sought to frame his monarchy as unified and modern, the old fracture surfaced. Camilla's hand, lifted in protest, was not just a gesture. It was the eruption of years of tension between a queen consort still fighting for acceptance and a princess who, without speaking a word, had already won it. The conflict was never sudden, it was inevitable. The grandeur of St. George's Hall was supposed to remind the nation of strength. The gilded ceilings, the endless rows of portraits, the hushed reverence of the crowd. It was all arranged to project permanence. King Charles stood at the lectern, his voice softer than it once was, yet weighted with history. He spoke of modernization, of a monarchy slimmed for efficiency, of a crown that could survive in the 21st century not by clinging to excess, but by embracing renewal. The decree was symbolic, yet it bore the weight of an unspoken promise. The monarchy would endure, not as it had, but as it must. And then, silence fractured. Camilla's hand rose, not to clap, not to wave, but in a gesture that seemed to freeze the hall. A small rebellion, a protest carried out in plain sight. For one breathless moment, no one moved. The speech faltered. The courtiers shifted uneasily. Every eye turned toward the queen consort, whose expression betrayed the strain of years of doubt, years of fighting to be accepted, and failing to eclipse the woman standing just steps away. Because there she was, Catherine, not speaking, not gesturing, simply standing with the quiet composure that had come to define her. She did not need to answer Camilla's defiance. Her very calmness was an answer. Her presence alone, steady and unshaken, made the gesture look small, desperate. In that instant, Catherine became not just the Princess of Wales, but the silent center of the monarchy's gravity. The tension deepened when Princess Anne, never one for theatrics, leaned ever so slightly toward a confidant and murmured words later repeated by more than one insider. "This isn't symbolic anymore," she said. To those close enough to hear, the meaning was unmistakable. Charles's decree had not just shifted duties on paper. It had confirmed the truth already being whispered in corridors. Catherine was moving to the forefront, while Camilla was being quietly ushered aside. The signs had been there for weeks, if not months. Insiders noted the subtle changes, the order of names in palace communications, where once Camilla followed Charles but now Catherine appeared first. The cameras caught it. Camilla's hand raised not in applause, not in greeting, but in something far more unsettling. A silent protest, right there, as King Charles struggled through his words. You could hear the gasp, sharp and unprepared, echo through the chamber. For a moment, time itself seemed to fracture. The speech, meant to symbolize unity, faltered. The room held its breath, Windsor suspended between loyalty and rebellion. Faces stiffened, eyes darted from Charles to Camilla, then, almost instinctively, toward Catherine. She wasn't speaking. She didn't move. Yet her very presence became the anchor of the moment, and in that frozen silence, one thought rang louder than any applause or royal decree. Has the tide turned? Has the crown's weight shifted from a king battling frailty, from a queen consort revealing cracks in her composure, to the princess who has quietly commanded devotion through grace, resilience, and the sheer force of survival? For the first time, perhaps, the question could no longer be ignored. Has Catherine become the true power of the monarchy, while Camilla's shadow begins to fade away? It was meant to be a moment of dignity, King Charles stepping forward with a decree crafted to remind the nation that the monarchy was not fading but reshaping itself for the modern age. His words spoke of renewal, of streamlining tradition, of bridging the gap between centuries of ritual and a people who demanded relevance in their everyday lives. It wasn't politics, not in the raw sense, but something subtler, an attempt to anchor the crown in trust, in image, in the delicate bond between monarch and subject. And yet, in the quiet shadows of his speech, another story was unfolding. Because while Charles's decree promised change, it was Catherine who already embodied it. The devoted wife who never abandoned her husband in his darkest hour, the mother whose wit strength reminded the people of Diana, and the royal figure whose warmth felt unmanufactured. Catherine had grown into something extraordinary. Unlike many who wore crowns before her, she didn't need to command respect. She drew it naturally. She was not feared. She was loved, and love, in the fragile theater of monarchy, is the most powerful weapon of all. But on this day, when Charles sought to crown his reign with symbolic progress, the stage cracked open. The cameras lingered too long, the audience too alert, and suddenly the gesture no one expected cut through the silence like a blade. Camilla's hand lifted not with grace but with defiance, a flicker of rebellion in full view of the kingdom. The air stiffened. The decree, the modernization, the carefully measured words, all of it seemed secondary. What mattered now was not the speech itself but the fracture it revealed. A queen consort unsettled, a king faltering, and Catherine, silent, radiant, unshaken, standing as the figure the public could not take their eyes off. The question was no longer about decrees or reforms. It was about power, perception, and a single gesture of protest that threatened to rewrite the monarchy's story. Once she was just Kate Middleton, the commoner, who captured the heart of a future king. The press treated her with both fascination and cruelty, dissecting her wardrobe, her background, her very smile. Yet through years of scrutiny, she never stumbled. No scandals, no reckless remarks, no shadows that could stain her rise. Instead, she moved with patience, with quiet dignity, with a steadiness that the public slowly began to trust. Step by step, Catherine transformed from an outsider into the Princess of Wales, a title once defined by Diana's fire and tragedy, now redefined by Catherine's grace and resilience, just beneath the king himself. Camilla's schedule, once bustling with patronages, began to shrink. A speech postponed, an appearance reassigned, an initiative quietly handed to Catherine's office. What the public saw as happenstance, those within Windsor recognized as restructuring. To those who served the crown, it felt like a fracture. On the surface, the monarchy remained a single institution, unified under the king. But beneath, two currents pulled in opposite directions, one anchored to Camilla, fighting for relevance, the other carried by Catherine, rising naturally into the role history seemed to demand of her. It was not just personal rivalry, it was institutional repositioning. The monarchy itself was shifting, recalibrating, tilting its weight toward the figure the people adored. And so, that moment in St. George's Hall became more than a passing gesture. It was the image of a monarchy divided, of a queen consort exposing the raw tension, of a princess silently assuming the role that others were only beginning to admit aloud. The conflict was no longer hidden in whispers or shuffled schedules. It had been laid bare for all to see. It came quietly at first, in words meant as praise but heard as prophecy. During a carefully staged event, Charles referred to Catherine in tones unmistakable. He compared her to Diana, not in tragedy but in devotion, in the natural bond she had forged with the people. The press seized on it instantly. For years, comparisons had been whispered but never spoken by the king himself. In that single acknowledgement, Charles elevated Catherine beyond the role of Princess of Wales. He placed her in the lineage of Diana, the eternal icon, and in doing so, drew a line that could never be erased. From there, Catherine's role transformed before the public eye. No longer merely the supportive consort at William's side, she began to take on duties that looked less like preparation and more like reign. She was briefed on foreign policy, consulted before state visits, dispatched alone to represent the crown abroad. Her meetings with heads of state were no longer ceremonial. They were substantive, weighty, decisive. In her calm, deliberate presence, the world began to see not just the future queen, but the living embodiment of the monarchy's survival. And while Catherine rose, Camilla retreated. What began as a subtle reduction in her schedule soon became impossible to ignore. Engagements were cancelled with little explanation. Patronages once highlighted in the press slipped quietly into the hands of younger royals or into Catherine's own expanding portfolio. Within the palace, the shift grew starker. Trusted staff members, sensing the direction of the tide, began to resign. The queen consort's circle grew smaller, her public voice fainter, her presence increasingly isolated. The contrast was brutal, almost theatrical. On one side, Catherine ascending, graceful, steady, stepping into the role the people already believed was hers. On the other, Camilla withdrawing, shrinking, a figure once defended by the king, now left in the long shadow of a daughter-in-law whose popularity could not be matched. This was the moment of no return. The monarchy had chosen, or perhaps the people had chosen for it. Charles's words, Catherine's actions, Camilla's silence, all converged to mark the irreversible shift. From this point forward, the balance of power within the royal family was no longer in question. It had tipped permanently. The ripple spread swiftly, far beyond the palace gates. In the press, headlines stopped framing Catherine as simply the Princess of Wales and began speaking of her as the monarchy's anchor. On social media, the phrase caught fire, the Catherine era. Supporters across the globe championed her as the true face of the royal family, sharing images of her engagements with words of admiration usually reserved for monarchs themselves. It was no longer speculation, it was celebration, the public crowning her with loyalty. For Camilla, the opposite unfolded. Her appearances dwindled until absence became the story itself. Commentators described it as a death by invisibility. Not scandal, not disgrace, but something quieter, harsher. She was fading, not through rejection, but through erasure. The queen consort title remained, yet the influence attached to it slipped away, piece by piece, until she was present only in name. Amid this, William's role grew more crucial. He was no longer seen simply as the heir waiting in the wings, but as the stabilizer beside Catherine. The figure ensuring the monarchy's transition was smooth rather than fractured. His support was unwavering, deliberate, and visible. Together they projected unity in contrast to the fractures that haunted his father's reign. The consequences were unmistakable. The monarchy's public face was no longer Charles and Camilla, but William and Catherine. And though the king still wore the crown, the world had already shifted its gaze, its faith, its affection toward the couple who embodied its future. Monarchies do not always change with the crash of trumpets or the thunder of coronations. More often, they shift in silence, through gestures, through glances, through the subtle rearranging of duties that only later reveal themselves as history. What unfolded in Windsor was not a declaration, but a quiet revolution, a rate see, eyes at hand, a halted breath, a princess standing still while everything moved around her. Catherine has become, in the eyes of many, something larger than her title allows. She is already performing queen-like duties, already commanding the love and trust that sustain the institution. She has become the figure people turn to instinctively, the embodiment of continuity, the promise of survival. And beside her, Camilla drifts into the background, a reminder that not all crowns are equal, and not all queens are truly seen. So the question lingers, suspended in the silence left after St. George's Hall. Is Catherine already queen in everything but name? Has the monarchy itself chosen, not with ceremony, but with necessity? And if so, what happens next? When power shifts not through abdication or death, but through quiet evolution behind closed doors, how does a monarchy built on tradition write its new chapter? The answer, like the silence that followed Camilla's protest, remains unspoken. For now,